You find yourself in Babylon, June 323 BC. The air in the palace is thick with incense sweat and the metallic tang of fear. The unconquerable master of the world is dying. Not from a Persian spear, but from a void. A wound carved into his soul 8 months earlier when the only man he ever truly loved, Hephaestion, was torn from his life. For 8 agonizing months, Alexander the Great has been a ghost haunting his own empire, a king fueled by undiluted wine and a grief so colossal it defied reason. He crucified the doctor who failed to save his lover. He ordered the manes of every horse in the empire to be shorn in mourning. This was not the behavior of a stable god-king, it was the raw, primal scream of a man whose other half had been ripped away. And his generals, the men who followed him to the edge of the known world, they're watching. They don't see a grieving monarch they must protect. They see a fatal vulnerability. They see a broken man. They know that when Hephaestion died, Alexander started dying too. This isn't just the story of a king's death. This is the autopsy of the greatest and most dangerous homosexual love affair of the ancient world. A bond that forged an empire and then burned it to the ground. So what really happened in that fever-soaked room? The official story blames a fever, a convenient, sterile explanation. But was it, or did his all-consuming grief for his male lover turn him into the perfect target? Did the men who resented their love affair exploit that broken heart to deliver the final blow? Could an empire truly be destroyed by a love it refused to understand? It turns out Alexander's most fatal curse wasn't power, it was passion. A love so absolute it became the Achilles heel of his entire empire. And the most chilling part, the conspirators may not have needed a vial of poison. They just had to wait for his heart to finish the job. Before we enter these cursed chambers where love became a weapon and grief became a death sentence, tell me in the comments. Where in the world are you hearing this story? I love knowing our investigation spans the globe. Stick with us, because the evidence we're about to uncover will change everything you thought you knew about the world's greatest conqueror. The autopsy begins now. To understand how a god-king ends up paralyzed in a Babylonian palace, you first have to understand the system that created him. Not the military machine, but the psychological one. Its collapse wasn't a sudden break, but a slow, creeping fever, a rise in temperature so gradual, so intoxicating, that no one inside the empire noticed the danger until the water around them began to boil. We will track this heat degree by agonizing degree. At first, the environment feels perfect. We're in the early days of the campaign, a world forged in the simple, brutal clarity of the Macedonian phalanx. The operating system is straightforward. Courage is rewarded, victory is celebrated, and loyalty is the coin of the realm. Alexander is not yet a god. He is the first among equals, the brilliant, charismatic leader of his hetairoi, his companions. And at the heart of this system is a relationship that seems to be its purest expression, Alexander and Hephaestion. From boyhood, their bond was legendary. When they visited the site of Troy, Alexander laid a wreath at the tomb of his ancestor Achilles, while Hephaestion paid homage at the tomb of Patroclus. The message was not subtle, and it was understood by all. They were two halves of a single heroic soul. This wasn't just a friendship. In the warrior culture of Macedon, it was the ultimate model of loyalty, a sacred partnership that anchored the entire command structure. The language of this era is one of nobility. They speak of brotherhood, of shared glory, of a bond stronger than blood. The mechanism is simple personal devotion to the king, exemplified by his devotion to his closest companion, creates a cascade of loyalty throughout the army. When a common soldier sees his king treat a friend with such profound love and respect, he believes he is part of a just and honorable enterprise. We see it in the accounts of how they fought side by side, shared their cloaks on cold nights, and planned the conquest of the world in the shared space of a single tent. The human cost. At this stage, there isn't one. In fact, there is only human benefit. A soldier fights harder, a general advises more freely, and an army feels invincible because it is bound by what appears to be genuine, unshakable love. The system works. The climate is temperate, nourishing, and everything feels right. But even here, a forensic historian must note a small dangerous detail. The system's stability is already entirely dependent on the stability of just two men. What happens when that noble bond is no longer enough to secure an empire? What happens when a king needs to control not just friends, but subjects? The atmosphere shifts almost imperceptibly. The climate is now pleasantly warm. Alexander, having conquered the Persian Empire, makes a strategic decision. To rule his new multicultural domain, he must become more than just a Macedonian king. He must become a Persian one too. Thus begins the great experiment in cultural integration. On the surface, it seems logical. He adopts Persian dress, the flowing silks and diadems of a great king. He encourages his men to marry Persian noblewomen in the great mass wedding at Susa. He rebuilds temples and respects local traditions. The language is all about progress and unity. A marriage of East and West. A new world order, a respect for the conquered. The goal he claims is homonoia, a harmony of all peoples. But then comes proskynesis, the Persian custom of bowing down, of prostrating oneself before the king. To the Persians, it was a gesture of deep respect for the office of the king. To the Macedonians, it was an act of worship reserved only for the gods. And Alexander, who was beginning to believe he was, one started to demand it. Here the mechanism of the system changes. Loyalty is no longer just about bravery in battle or a shared laugh over wine. It is now measured by a performance. It is a public test of submission. Will you kneel? Hephaestion, ever the pragmatist and utterly devoted to Alexander's vision, kneels. He sees it as a necessary political tool. But many of the old guard, the grizzled Macedonian veterans who had bled for Alexander, refuse. They see a betrayal of everything they stood for. They didn't conquer the world's largest empire just to adopt the customs of the defeated. The human cost, once invisible, now begins to surface. We see it in the historian Callisthenes, Alexander's own chronicler, who publicly argues against proskynesis and is later implicated in a conspiracy and killed. We see it in the grumbling of the common soldiers who whisper that their king is becoming a foreign tyrant. The court is no longer a band of brothers. It is a theater divided between those willing to perform their loyalty and those who cling to an older, simpler code. The warm, comfortable bath of imperial unity has a dangerous undercurrent. The system is no longer just rewarding loyalty. It is beginning to punish dissent, however subtle. And Alexander, increasingly isolated by his own divine ambitions, starts to see the world in a dangerous binary. Those who are with him, like Hephaestion, and those who are against him. What happens when those whispers of dissent become spoken words? What happens when a friend, not an enemy, dares to speak the truth in this new performative court? The air is now simmering with tension. The heat is undeniable. The era of paranoia and blood has begun. The system Alexander has built, which now demands absolute, unquestioning performative loyalty, turns on itself with terrifying efficiency. The first great purge is the Philotas affair. Philotas, son of the legendary general Parmenion, is accused of failing to report a plot against Alexander's life. Under torture, he confesses, whether truthfully or not, we'll never know. He is executed, but the system's logic demands more. To eliminate a threat, you must eliminate its roots. So Alexander sends assassins to murder Philotas's father, Parmenion, the man who had secured his throne, the most respected general in Macedon, without a trial, without even a formal accusation. The language used is cold and bureaucratic, ensuring state security, eliminating a potential threat, a necessary, if regrettable, action. The mechanism has evolved into a weapon of terror. Fear is now official policy. The message is brutally clear: no one is safe. Your service, your history, your loyalty, none of it matters if you fall under the shadow of the king's suspicion. And then comes the night that proves it. The murder of Clitus the Black. In a drunken feast, Clitus, the man who had physically saved Alexander's life at the Battle of the Granicus, confronts the king. He mocks Alexander's Persian affectations and his claims of divinity, reminding him that his power was built on Macedonian blood. In a blind rage fueled by wine and an ego that could no longer tolerate criticism, Alexander grabs a spear and runs Clitus through. The immediate aftermath is a portrait of a broken man weeping over the body of the friend he has just murdered. And who is there to pull him away to calm his rage to manage the horrific fallout Hephaestion? This event is the system's singularity. It proves that the circle of trust has shrunk to exactly one person. Everyone else, no matter how close, is disposable. The human cost is catastrophic. The generals and advisors who remain learn a fatal lesson. Truth is treason. Silence is survival. Flattery is the only safe language. Alexander is now surrounded not by counselors, but by sycophants. He is utterly alone, save for the one man he believes will never challenge him, only support him. The entire psychological and political stability of the largest empire on earth now rests on the shoulders of one man, Hephaestion. He is no longer just the king's lover and friend. He is the system's emotional regulator, its chief diplomat, its only true believer. He has become the indispensable pillar holding up a fatally unstable structure. What happens when that single pillar is suddenly kicked out from under it? The atmosphere is now scorching. The system faces a catastrophic failure from which it will never recover. In Ecbatana, after a bout of fever and heavy drinking, Hephaestion dies. The collapse is immediate and total. This is not the measured grief of a king. This is the apocalyptic despair of a man who has lost his anchor to reality. Alexander's reaction is not policy, it is psychosis. He lies weeping on his lover's body for a day and a night, refusing to eat or speak. He has the attending physician crucified. He orders all the horses in the region to have their manes cut short. He commands that the sacred flames in the temples of Persia be extinguished, an act of sacrilege punishable by death, a sign that the death of his beloved meant the gods themselves should mourn in darkness. The official language is of state mourning and divine honors. Alexander demands that the oracle at Siwa declare Hephaestion a god. He launches a brutal military campaign against the Caucaeans, slaughtering them as a funeral offering to Hephaestion's spirit. But this isn't governance. This is a rampage. The mechanism is now in its death throes. The system Alexander built has no protocol for a broken, grieving god. It cannot process his pain. It can only react to his madness. The generals, the architects of his victories, are now forced to navigate the whims of an unstable, self-destructive autocrat whose every decision is dictated by grief. They don't just see a grieving man. They see the end of the world. They see a leader whose emotional state is now the single greatest threat to the empire and to their own lives. The human cost is now Alexander himself. He arrives in Babylon, a city rife with ill omens, and plunges into a marathon of ritualistic drinking parties. It is a performance of celebration, but it looks like a death wish. He is trying to fill the void left by Hephaestion with wine, with noise, with anything to distract him from the silence. His body, already scarred by a dozen war wounds, weakened by years of campaigning, and ravaged by alcohol, is at its breaking point. His loyal generals are all there, but they are no longer his companions. They are vultures circling a dying lion. They see a king who is psychologically shattered and physically spent. They see a system without its linchpin, and they see an opportunity. The machine that was built on the foundation of an inseparable love is about to be consumed by the fire that its collapse has ignited. The suffocating heat of this environment is no longer just a metaphor. It is the fever that is about to claim the king. The system was at a rolling boil, the pressure intolerable. Alexander the God King had been psychologically flayed by the death of his other half, and his empire was now hostage to his grief. But the final act of this tragedy was not a single moment. It was a relentless 12-month cascade of miscalculation, hubris, and sorrow. This is the linear story of what happened, the precise chain of events that led a conqueror from the edge of the world to a deathbed in Babylon. Our story begins with the return from India. This was not a triumphant procession. It was a death march. In his ambition to outdo the legends of the past, Alexander chose to lead his army back through the Gedrosian Desert, one of the most inhospitable places on Earth. For 60 days, his army, the most successful fighting force in history, was brutalized not by an enemy, but by their own commander's pride. The sun was a merciless hammer. Water was a distant memory. The sand drank the sweat from their bodies and buried their dead. Thousands perished from heat stroke and dehydration. Pack animals were eaten. The survivors, skeletal and haunted, finally stumbled out of that hellscape, but they were changed. They no longer looked at their king with pure adoration. They had seen his ambition curdle into recklessness. They had seen the god gamble with their lives and lose. It was the first time the machine had shown a catastrophic design flaw. The myth of his infallibility had been wounded, perhaps fatally. When he returned to the heart of his Persian Empire, he found not order but chaos. The satraps, the governors he had left in charge, had been ruling like petty kings, embezzling funds and terrorizing the local populations. Alexander's response was not that of a measured statesman. It was the swift, brutal reaction of a man who senses control slipping from his grasp. He unleashed a purge. Corrupt governors were rounded up and executed without trial. It was a terrifying display of absolute power, a message sent across the empire that the master had returned and he was in no mood for forgiveness. The atmosphere of fear, once simmering, now thickened. But it was at Susa that his vision for a hybrid empire took its most controversial form. He orchestrated a grand spectacle, a mass wedding of 10,000 of his Macedonian soldiers to Persian noblewomen. On the surface, it was a beautiful symbol of unity. Alexander himself married Statira, a daughter of the former king Darius, and gave another of Darius's daughters to Hephaestion. It was a political masterstroke, an attempt to literally breed a new ruling class that was both Greek and Persian. But for the common soldier, it was an act of coercion. These were men who had been away from their homes for over a decade, who dreamt of returning to Macedonia, not of starting new families in a foreign land with women they did not know. They complied because they had no choice, but the resentment was deep. Alexander was no longer just their king. He was a social engineer, treating their lives and their bloodlines as raw material for his grand imperial project. This simmering resentment finally boiled over at Oppius. When Alexander announced his plan to send the older veterans home, the army erupted. They did not cheer. They mutinied. They felt they were being discarded, replaced by the Persian troops Alexander was now training. For the first time, they openly defied him, shouting for him to dismiss them all and go wage war with his father, the god Ammon. Alexander's reaction was a masterclass in psychological warfare. He did not negotiate. He leapt from the speaker's platform, pointed into the crowd at the 13 most vocal ringleaders, and had them dragged away and executed on the spot. The army was stunned into silence. He then returned to the platform not in a rage, but with the cold fury of a wounded father. He delivered a speech that was part reprimand, part emotional blackmail, reminding them of how he had led them from poverty to unimaginable wealth, how he had shared their wounds and their glories. Then he locked himself in his tent for 3 days, refusing to see anyone but his Persian guards. It worked. The Macedonians, consumed with guilt, came to his tent begging for forgiveness. There was a tearful reconciliation, but the dynamic had been exposed. The bond was no longer one of simple love and loyalty. It was a complex, volatile relationship of dependence, fear, and emotional manipulation. A sensible leader would have seen this as a sign to consolidate, to heal the rifts, to govern the vast territory he already possessed. A sensible person would pivot here. Alexander did not. Instead, he began planning his next great campaign, the conquest of Arabia. An empire already stretched to its breaking point was about to lose its one remaining pillar of stability. The narrative of Alexander's final year is not complete without understanding that it is in fact 2 stories, the story before Hephaestion's death and the story after. The court was in Ecbatana when it happened. Hephaestion fell ill with a fever. Alexander, initially distracted by athletic games, was not overly concerned. The doctors of the age dealt with fevers constantly, but when his condition worsened, Alexander rushed to his side, only to find him already dead. The moment Hephaestion died, the Alexander who had conquered the world died with him. What was left was a vessel of pure apocalyptic grief. The accounts are shocking. He threw himself onto his friend's body and lay there for nearly a day, weeping, until he had to be physically dragged away. He ordered the physician Glaucius to be crucified for his failure. This was not mourning. It was a declaration of war on reality itself. He commanded that the manes and tails of all horses and mules be cut. He had the battlements of the surrounding cities torn down. Most shockingly, he ordered the sacred fires of the Persian temples to be extinguished, a sacrilegious act that plunged the region into both literal and spiritual darkness. He was forcing the entire world to mirror the desolation in his own soul. The cost of his grief was astronomical, both financially and politically. He commissioned a funeral pyre for Hephaestion in Babylon, so magnificent, so expensive, that its cost was estimated at 12,000 talents, a sum that could have funded several military campaigns equivalent to billions of dollars today. It was an act of such monumental waste that it bordered on madness. He then wrote to the oracle of the god Ammon at Siwa, the same oracle that had confirmed his own divinity, with a single insane demand to grant Hephaestion divine honors. He was attempting to use his imperial power to command the gods themselves. The generals watched this all unfold with a mixture of fear and cold calculation. They saw their king, the strategic genius, completely unhinged. He was spending the imperial treasury on a dead man. His judgment was gone, replaced by a reckless, emotional nihilism. For them, Hephaestion's death wasn't just a personal tragedy for the king, it was a political emergency. The man holding the reins of the empire was now a madman, and he was galloping them all towards a cliff. The death of the king's lover hadn't just created a power vacuum, it had created a motive. It was now arguably in the best interest of the empire for the king's reign to end before he dragged them all down with him. And so he came to Babylon, the magnificent ancient city that was to be the heart of his new world. But the city was heavy with prophecy. The Chaldean priests had warned him not to enter, that the city would be fatal to him. In a bizarre episode, a local man had snuck into the palace, put on the king's robes and diadem, and sat silently on his throne. It was seen as a terrifying omen. Babylon was not a capital, it was a tomb waiting for its occupant. Ignoring the warnings, Alexander plunged into a final desperate series of banquets and drinking parties. This was not celebration, it was a systematic attempt to drown his grief in alcohol. The royal diaries, the official court record, give us a clinical timeline of the end. On the 18th of the month of Decios, he feasted and drank late into the night with his friend Medius of Larissa. He then went to another party and another. It was after drinking a massive unmixed bowl of wine, the so-called cup of Heracles, that he was said to have cried out sharply as if struck by a spear. The pain began. The fever followed. The next 12 days were a slow, agonizing descent. The conqueror of the world was rendered helpless by an enemy he could not see. The diaries paint a grim picture. Day by day, the fever intensified. He was moved to cooler parts of the palace, bathed in the river, but nothing worked. Soon he could no longer speak. The man whose voice had commanded hundreds of thousands of soldiers was reduced to communicating with feeble gestures of his hands and eyes. Recognizing the end was near, his generals allowed the army, his loyal Macedonians, to file past his bedside. One by one, the men who had followed him across deserts and mountains, who had fought and bled for him, walked past their silent, dying king in a final, heartbreaking farewell. The final scene is one of the most famous and most contested in all of history. The generals gathered around him. Perdiccas, his second-in-command, now that Hephaestion was gone, asked the question on which the fate of the world depended. "To whom do you leave your kingdom?" With his last breath, Alexander is said to have whispered a single ambiguous phrase. Was it toi kratistoi, meaning to the strongest, or was it toi krateroi, meaning to Craterus, one of his most able generals, who was at that moment far away in Cilicia? We will never know. But in that ambiguity, that final riddle, lay the seeds of destruction. It was either a cynical prophecy or a final tragic miscommunication. Either way, it was not a plan for succession. It was a declaration of war. He had given them an empire, and with his last breath, he gave them a reason to tear it all apart. The ring, the symbol of his power, was passed to Perdiccas. The king was dead. The real war was about to begin. The king is dead. The narrative of his final agonizing year has been laid out. But the story of what happened is not the same as the truth. Now we leave the timeline and enter the chamber of analysis. The body has been gone for 2 millennia. The witnesses have turned to dust, but the evidence remains scattered across the crime scene of history. It is time to open the coldest case of all and conduct the autopsy on the death of an empire. Let us open the file. Case file: the Babylonian fever. The victim, Alexander III of Macedon, age 32. The official cause of death is contested. The official story, the one repeated in textbooks for centuries, is neat, simple, and safe. It tells us that Alexander the Great, his body weakened by years of campaigning and a recent bout of heavy drinking, contracted a disease likely malaria or typhoid fever, and succumbed to it like any other mortal. It is a story of biology, not betrayal. It is a story that calms the nerves and assigns no blame. It suggests that the great man was simply unlucky. But here in the cursed chambers, we do not believe in luck. We believe in systems, motives, and the fine print of history. The official story is not an explanation. It is a hypothesis, and it is time to test it against the evidence. Our first exhibit is the primary written record of Alexander's final days, the royal diaries. These are the court journals purportedly recording the king's condition hour by hour. Quoted by later historians like Arrian and Plutarch, they present a clinical, almost sterile account of a man succumbing to illness. They detail the rising fever, the baths, the sacrifices to the gods, the slow descent into paralysis and silence. On its face, this document seems to debunk any theory of a fast-acting poison. The 12-day timeline is too long for the common poisons of the ancient world. Aconite, hemlock, these kill in hours, not weeks. So the case for disease seems stronger. But look closer. Read the diaries not as a doctor, but as a detective. Notice the language. It is precise, methodical, and chillingly devoid of emotion. It records the king's symptoms, but not the political chaos that must have been erupting around him. There are no mentions of the urgent whispers between generals, the panicked securing of the treasury, the strategic positioning of troops. It's a medical chart, not a diary. And that very precision is what makes it so deeply suspicious. It reads like a carefully constructed alibi, a document prepared to prove that everything was done by the book, while the real story was happening off the page. Furthermore, it doesn't rule out a more sophisticated, slow-acting poison. Ancient toxicologists were masters of their craft. Plants like hellebore could be administered over days, producing symptoms of a creeping paralysis and fever that perfectly mimicked a natural illness. The diaries in their meticulous detail could just as easily be the record of a successful patient assassination as a losing battle with disease. Exhibit A. The official story's strongest proof is, in fact, a Trojan horse. It seems to offer a clear narrative, but it hides within its belly a dozen other possibilities. It exonerates no one. Our second exhibit is the victim himself. Alexander's body was not that of a healthy 32-year-old. It was a roadmap of trauma, a testament to a life lived at a punishing, impossible pace. Let us conduct a forensic examination. He had survived countless wounds, any one of which could have killed him. A sword blow to the head, a thigh wound that left him with a limp, and most grievously an arrow that had pierced his lung during the siege of the Malian city in India. His own doctors believed that wound would be fatal. He survived, but his respiratory system would have been permanently compromised. Add to this the relentless physical stress of a decade of non-stop campaigning, marching thousands of miles across every type of terrain imaginable. Then add the alcoholism. The sources are clear. Alexander was a prodigious and often violent drinker. His liver must have been in a state of chronic protest. His body was a fortress that had been under siege for 15 years, with its walls crumbling and its defenders exhausted. But the final critical wound was not to his body, but to his psyche. Modern science has a term for it: psychoneuroimmunology. It is the clinical proof that the mind and the body are inextricably linked. Extreme grief like that which Alexander suffered after Hephaestion's death is not just an emotion, it is a physiological state. It floods the body with the stress hormone cortisol, which over time decimates the immune system. It disrupts sleep, encourages reckless behavior, and leaves the body profoundly vulnerable to opportunistic infections. Hephaestion's death didn't just break Alexander's spirit, it dismantled his body's defenses from the inside out. He was in a very real medical sense immunocompromised. Any common pathogen, a malarial mosquito, a sip of contaminated water carrying typhoid that a healthy man might have fought off, would have been a death sentence for him. Exhibit B proves that Alexander was a dead man, walking long before he entered Babylon. The question is no longer what killed him, but rather, what delivered the final blow? Was it a virus, a bacteria, or a human hand? This brings us to our final exhibit, the cast of characters surrounding his deathbed. If this was a murder, the room was filled with suspects, each with a rock-solid motive. First, the prime suspects for direct action. Antipater, the old regent of Macedon, and his son Cassander. Alexander had just summoned Antipater to Babylon, a clear sign that the old general was about to be replaced and likely executed. Cassander was present in court and, according to one account, had a violent argument with Alexander after mocking the Persian custom of proskynesis. The story goes that Alexander slammed his head against a wall. Cassander would despise Alexander's memory for the rest of his life. Did they arrange for a poison to be brought from Macedon? It is the classic, most direct conspiracy theory. But perhaps the real conspiracy was more subtle. Let's examine the others. Ptolemy, Seleucus, Perdiccas, the inner circle, his loyal companions. Their motive was not necessarily murder, but opportunity. They knew the king was dying. They knew he had no legitimate adult heir. They knew his vast empire was a prize about to be shattered into pieces. Their actions speak louder than any accusation. They gathered around his bed not to save him, but to secure their own futures. Their failure to extract a clear succession plan from him, their immediate and bloody wars against each other the moment he died, this is not the behavior of loyal subordinates. It is the behavior of heirs, a parent eagerly awaiting the reading of the will. Their crime may have been a conspiracy of inaction. Why find a better doctor? Why stop the endless drinking parties that were clearly killing him? Every day he grew weaker, their own potential power grew stronger. They didn't have to kill him, they just had to let him die. So we assemble the evidence, a document that reads like an alibi, a body primed for destruction by war, alcohol, and grief. A room full of men whose ambition far outweighed their loyalty. The real mechanism of Alexander's death becomes clear. It was not a single event, but a perfect storm. The what is almost irrelevant. Poison, disease, pancreatitis, any of these could have been the final instrument. The how is what matters. A physically wrecked body collided with a psychologically shattered mind inside. A political environment of pure, predatory ambition. The system itself had become the poison, a system that demanded a leader be a god but gave him no way to cope with his very human pain. A system that rewarded loyalty with power, inevitably creating men who desired that power for themselves. A system that had become so large, so dependent on one man's life force, that his death was the only logical outcome. And so we arrive at our verdict. The cursed chamber was not a room in Babylon. It was the very heart of Alexander's empire. It was a system built on a fatal paradox. It required a superhuman leader, but was run by deeply, ruthlessly human men. The curse was a broken heart in a broken body, amplified by a system of ambition that saw a grieving, vulnerable king as an opportunity, not a tragedy. Did someone put poison in his cup? Possibly. But by the time he drank that final cup of wine, Alexander was already dying. He was dying from the arrow in his lung, from the years of drink, from the grief that had hollowed out his soul, and from the chilling realization that the men he called his friends were simply waiting for him to be gone. The true poison was the empire itself, and he had been drinking it day by day for 13 years. We step now from the chamber of autopsy into the court of history. The evidence has been presented, the exhibits examined. The question remains who or what killed Alexander the Great? The verdict of this chamber is, this Alexander was a casualty of the very system he designed. He died of a common illness that became an inescapable death sentence because of his uncommon grief. The true cause of death was the collision of his profound love and his profound ambition. His love for Hephaestion made him human and vulnerable. His ambition to be a god created a court of rivals who saw that vulnerability not as a tragedy to be soothed, but as an opportunity to be seized. Did Cassander's poison finish him? Did a malarial mosquito deliver the fatal bite? In the end, it doesn't matter. These are merely potential weapons. The motive and the opportunity were provided by the system itself. His generals didn't need to be murderers. They only needed to be what he had trained them to be: ruthless, patient, and hungry for power. The true poison was the atmosphere of the court he had created, and he had been breathing it in for years. The echo of his death was not silence, but a political supernova. His final ambiguous words, "to the strongest," were not a succession plan. They were an epitaph for unity. The moment his breath left his body, his empire, the largest the world had ever known, became a corpse to be devoured. His generals, the Diadochi, fell upon it like wolves. The wars of the successors raged for 50 years, a bloody, chaotic free-for-all that pitted friend against friend and father against son. His legacy was baptized in the blood of those he had led. His own family was systematically exterminated in the ensuing power struggle. His mother Olympias, his wife Roxane, and his young son and heir Alexander IV were all murdered. The bloodline of the great conqueror was wiped from the earth. Yet here lies the final staggering irony. The death of his empire was the birth of his true legacy. From the ashes of his singular vision rose the Hellenistic kingdoms, the Ptolemies in Egypt, the Seleucids in Persia, the Antigonids in Greece. These new dynasties born from the wreckage became the conduits for Greek culture, language, and philosophy. The city he founded, Alexandria, became home to the greatest library in the ancient world, a beacon of knowledge for centuries. In dying, Alexander achieved what he never could in life. He made Greek culture immortal by allowing his empire to die. His catastrophic failure as a succession planner became his greatest triumph as a cultural architect. History, it is said, is a logbook of plausible mistakes made with perfect confidence. Alexander confidently built an empire so vast only a god could rule it. Then he built a life so dependent on one man, it made him tragically human. His mistake was believing he could be both at once. He conquered the known world, but he could not conquer the grief in his own heart. And in the end, that was the only territory that mattered. So now the verdict is yours. What do you believe was the final blow? A conspirator's poison, a random fever, or the political fallout of a broken heart? Leave your ruling in the comments below. Subscribe to Cursed Chambers to unlock more of history's darkest secrets. Because the past is never truly dead, and its most dangerous ghosts are the ones we think we understand.